And a very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. I'm going to share the screen, of course, and you won't be surprised to see that the first picture that's going to be in front of you is not that similar to that of our host. One second, let me just move straight in there. There we go. Now, that's a familiar sight, I think, to everybody. It's just turning into full screen. There we go. There's a familiar sight. But in fact, I'm not going to say that much about the building, but there is something that I do want to say about it, and that is that attitudes to buildings such as ours have changed an enormous amount over the last few years. So I thought it was worth saying why buildings such as the original part of our college have now become so interesting to architecturalists. Used to it. I'm not sure why it says that. I'm assuming that you can hear me from the start. So right, let me do a quick change to show you a bit what Congregationalist architecture looked like 70 years before our building was built. This is the British School in Maidstone in 1823, and the reason why this building attracted my attention is that my great-great-grandfather was the person who ran it. In fact, my great-grandfather was a Congregationalist minister at the start of his career. And this is what the architecture of the educational system of the nonconformists looked like at the time. The British and Foreign School Society was a system set up by a man called Joseph Lancaster. It was an innovative way of teaching, and it was in some form or another adopted in schools across the world. In fact, many of the things we take for granted in traditional schools made an origin in a building of this kind. And you can see that it's small and it's modest. And as a matter of fact, the railway line was built directly under it. My great-great-grandfather lived in a house to the left, where there's now a new one, which very quickly fell down, by the way, so probably shaken to bits by the railway tunnel is my guess. And this is what buildings of that period look like. And it's an important building for another reason, because it's clearly a pre-Gothic revival building. In fact, nearly every house, every ordinary house of the 1820s looked a bit like this. Let me show you another one. Getting slight delay here on the images coming through. So let's hope, there we go, let's come through now. This is a house called, this is the Vicarage House in Walkeringham. Yeah. It's 1823, so you can see that it's the same age as that school building. And in a way, it's not that different from it. It's a very simple, symmetrical building. And in fact, nearly every detached house built during this period, this is the reign of George IV, of course, nearly every single house looked exactly the same. The rooms were arranged in a logical fashion around a staircase. Each of the rooms could be used for any purpose. The whole thing was very much standardized, and that's why architects introduced strange, whimsical details, such as that trellis that you can see on the right-hand side there. It's meant to be Chinese, is probably what they thought that they were doing. And you'll notice something else about this plan, which is it's a substantial house. It's got 3 decent rooms, plus a butler's pantry in the main block. And round the back, there's a great sprawling kitchen area that no architect really knew how to design. And the reason for that was partly because kitchens were becoming more and more sophisticated and more complicated. They needed more and more areas for specific tasks in this period, and architects couldn't cope with it. You notice also that on that plan there, on the left-hand side, there's a kind of sketchy tree. Can you see, just sort of in the middle on the left? And it's there to hide the fact that behind it is the door into the privy. So another thing about these houses is that they didn't really know, the architect was an engineer, as a matter of fact, this one, James Trubshaw, didn't really know how to design all that stuff at the back, the practical, the utilitarian parts of the building in a way that suited the formal and fairly grand classical style of the rest of the house. Now, compare that with this. This is a house from 20 years later. It's by A.W.N. Pugin in 1846, and everything about it is completely different from the house you've just seen. And the main part, and that's the part that's relevant to our oldest buildings, the main point to say about this is that from the outside of this building, you can see exactly what is going on. You can see how the building is built for a start. It's not just a rectangle with a flattish roof on top. It's something that explains to anyone who goes by how the house stands up. You could see it perhaps as a series of boxes that are put at right angles to each other. We call it a pinwheel plan. That's because we try to avoid calling it a swastika plan, which is what it most closely resembles. And on the right-hand side, you can see an altogether different type of building from the simple Georgian house that you saw a moment ago. The individual rooms are very distinct, and also all the service areas, the kitchen, pantry, scullery, and so on, they are part of the main part of the house. In fact, not only that, but looking at the photograph on the left-hand side, you can see all the kitchen stuff as part of the front of the building. There's nothing to be embarrassed about here. There's even a water closet you can see right next to the staircase window. You can see it on the plan on the right-hand side there, and actually you can just see it on the elevation as well. So this is a type of architecture which is explaining what it is doing. It's come out of a number of reasons. One of them was that the standard of architectural construction was actually very low at the time, and these Gothic revivalists, led by Pugin, are taking a stand against this. They're putting a lot of emphasis on the physical quality of the materials of the building. That's one reason. And the other reason is I think that people have got bored of Georgian houses with their square fronts and so on. Now, I'm mentioning this, as I say, because this is a very important stage in the development of the kind of building like our one, where you can tell exactly what it is from the outside. We all know where the Great Hall is. You don't need to be told once you've come into the garden. And it's buildings like this that explain it. The word for buildings like this today, the word we generally use, is realist. It's realism. That's to say the house is exactly doing the thing that it looks like. The kitchen looks like a kitchen. The front door looks like a kitchen. You aren't going to mistake any part of it. And not only that, the roof looks like a roof. The roof has a very big overhang at the eaves so that everyone can see how the water drains off. The chimneys are tall because they need to be, and so on and so forth. Now, to move back into institutional buildings again, I thought I'd show you this. This is a plan of a very small and very cheap building designed by Pugin a little later than the house in Ramsham. The house in Ramsham was an expensive house. This is a very cheap one. What Pugin found on the site was the part of this house that you can see in green. There was an early 19th century house on the site, and he was asked to convert this into the Convent of Mercy attached to the Church of St. Giles in the village of Cheadle in Staffordshire, which is one of his most splendid buildings of all. Now, what I did in this, as you can see, is I coloured in all the circulation area in pink. So what you'll see here is that anyone going from the church into the community room, where the members of the order would sit and spend a lot of their time, has to go all the way down that corridor on the left. There's an oratory sticking out. Then they go all the way along the street front, but hidden from the street by a wall. Then they go up, and then they go along, and then they go to the far side, and then they go north up through the community room. And in fact, the building at the very far end of this spectacularly long route, it's about 60 meters long, about 200 feet long. At the end of that is actually the earth closet, so the privies again. Now, what is extraordinary about this is that this corridor is very, very long relative to the size of the building, and you have to go along it to get from one place to another. Now, I know that the interior of Cavendish and so on has been changed a bit, but nevertheless, the principle remains, as everybody knows. You have to go a very long way in order to get anywhere. And this, it's important to point out that in plans such as this, it's intentional. Pugin could perfectly well have put a direct link going across the garden straight into the house. It would have been cheaper probably and more functional to do it. But what he wanted you to do was he wanted you to notice the different spaces as you went along. That's what the oratory is doing there. It wanted you to notice that you go through the hall, through the community room and so on. It stretches everything out. It gives these big Victorian buildings, as they get bigger and bigger, it gives them a sense of narrative to them. Things are changing as you go through the house. This was very important to the religious orders of the 19th century as they started to work out a way of living for new monastic orders. Now then, so what should a college look like? Well, in Pugin's view, the ideal college was Magdalen College, Oxford, although in fact, this is not actually as it ever was in the Middle Ages, because that gateway at the front right was designed by himself and it was built. And the bits of it apparently are in store. It could be put back, I gather. So he's showing an idealized version of what a college ought to look like. It's partly his revolt against the neoclassical building that's been built up the side off to the left here, which he didn't like. He called it the Italian barracks. And what this building is doing is pretty much what he was showing on that tiny, cheap scale in the convent in Cheadle. Everything is very clear. You can see where the chapel is, where the tower is. You can see where the president's lodgings are, where the gateway is, where the cloister is. Everything is very clear to the passerby. You can see where the kitchen is, as a matter of fact, which is at the back there. You can also see that all these places are linked with routes in different ways. That's the significance that he gave to the word cloister. So there is a picture building in the 1840s and 1850s of the idea that a modern religious educational establishment should have this stretched out, expressive feel to it. And this is an idea that caught on, and we all know what followed. Here's Keble College by William Butterfield, a great admirer of Pugin's. His career overlaps slightly, the very end of Pugin's life. Pugin lives until 1852. And it's pretty obvious here which this building is. No one is going to mistake this for a library, for example. One of the buildings that they're all reacting against are the buildings of what's now UCL in Gower Street in London, where there is a great big thing in the middle with columns and a pediment, and you don't know what it is. I don't know what it is, and I was a student there myself. So I think it's a library, I have a feeling, but it could be anything. Well, this couldn't be anything. This can only be one thing. It can only be a chapel. And furthermore, you have to walk across the quad to get to it, and everyone can see that you're doing it. So the shape of the building not only explains things, but it also encourages a certain way of life. Here is a second building. A second view. This is looking the opposite direction. The library and the refectory are on the side there, on the right-hand side. I'm sure you know the building. On the far left is what's now the Natural History Museum, which was a great Ruskinian building with an extraordinarily complicated building history. So you get here a kind of perfect Gothic vision, except possibly for the Radcliffe Canberra Dome background. So this is a picture of where architecture is, and it provides the background for how buildings such as ours began to develop. Now, I want to say something else about the early buildings of the college, but not actually about the buildings themselves, but about Samuel Morley, the college treasurer and the great mover behind the move to Cambridge from London. Samuel Morley is a very interesting figure in architectural history. This is the house that was designed for itself. It's actually lost a bit of, it had a little bit more on the right-hand side. It was a large rambling house. Part of it was demolished in the 1970s. It was designed by an architect with whom Morley had a great affinity. That's George Devey. Devey is the kind of architect whom architects themselves greatly admire, but nobody else has ever heard of. There are several in that category, I would say, an architect's architect, as it were. And Devey was someone who took Pugin's ideas about realism and about the importance of quality building to a further stage. Devey was the architect who saw enormous importance in precisely what was put where. He did a number of very unusual things. He mixed styles together a little bit. He did things that Pugin wouldn't have done. His buildings have a kind of Jacobean feeling to them, and Pugin is certainly against that. One of the most extraordinary buildings that Devey designs is St Albans Court in Nonington. And in this building, this is in East Kent, it's not far from where I am at the moment. And you can see here that the building has got this stone wall that fades away into the brickwork above. Now, the story that was told about this building, the urban myth, as it were, about this house, was that the idea was that a Victorian banker, his name was William Hammond, had decided to build a house that was fake old, that he built the base of his building as if it was the edge of a castle, and then he built a red brick house on top of it, and the whole thing was fundamentally ridiculous and sham and fake and all the other things that people like to say when they don't like a building. But I think that the opposite is precisely true. In fact, we know that Devey and Hammond, his client, spent a lot of time working out precisely the position of the bricks and the stone as they move around the house. The whole edge of the house is kind of fizzing in that way. The elevation of the house, which we will see in a second. Oh, we've gone the wrong way. There we are. The elevation of the house, as you can see, is like this all the way around. I don't know exactly if one can say for sure what it meant, because Davy was not the kind of architect who ever said what he was doing, really. He was famously taciturn, but we know that he put enormous value on the quality of pieces of building. And I think he probably wanted people to think a bit about what the brick and what the stone were doing. I think that that's the purpose, that was the idea that was going on behind this. He was a perfectionist, Davy. There's a famous story about Davy that a builder called him out on site, and they went up to the roof, and the builder said, there's a bit of a bodge up here, but we've managed to solve it in some way, stick a bit of lead somewhere. And anyway, said the builder to the architect, anyway, nobody will notice it because it's so far up. And Davy famously replied, I should be ashamed for the birds to see it. So he had a very purist view of architecture, and his connection with Morley was, as a matter of fact, a religious one. Both of them admired the religious values of the other. Davy was a member of the church founded by the father of the famous architect CFA Voysey. It was a Protestant sect of a rather austere kind. And Voysey worked for Davy in his youth. I think probably actually Voysey was more influenced by Davy than by anybody else. Davy is a famous name. Think of the white geometrical houses. They often appear as the backdrop to films. So if anyone saw The Dig a little while back, that was set around the house called Nonington, designed by Voysey. He's probably one of the most famous arts and crafts architects. But actually, Morley had another junior employee. That was Percy Morley Horder, who built a lot in Cambridge, very much less distinguished than Voysey, I'm afraid to say, but it certainly made an impact. There are large buildings in Jesus College. There's a building that was originally built as Cheshunt College just in the south of town, just off Trumpington Street. Now, let's move on to another aspect. So that's a little bit about why the Gothic revival is thought to be more interesting than it once was. There's quite a lot to say about it, and it tells us a lot about what Victorian architects and their clients were thinking and what they wanted to achieve. Here then is the second familiar view. Well, we know what it is. It's the staff combination room and the offices and the big rooms above. There's fantastic work going on in there at the moment, actually, upstairs. It looks really good at the moment. There's been some alterations, I imagine, for fire escape reasons, but it's been done extremely well. The building is designed by Herbert Ibbotson. Ibbotson also, not surprisingly, given the history of the college, also comes from a nonconformist background, and he makes an appearance in the, as it were, national architectural press on one occasion in particular. That's when he designs some houses at Hunstanton. Now, he lived in Hunstanton. His offices were in Cannon Street in London, but also from his home, which was a house that he designed for himself, and that's by the shore in Hunstanton. But these houses in particular stick out because they appear in a book called Country Cottages and Weekend Homes, which was one of the many houses built published in the first decade of the 20th century, which explain in detail how a good house is designed. I often like to say that the problem of how to design a house was pretty much solved by 1910. It's everything that's happened since in a way has been an experiment, because the basic facts about storage, the position of windows, the location of doors, the proportions of the rooms, and all this is addressed and solved very well by Edwardian architects. Take enormous interest in small houses, in small, relatively cheap houses. £756 is about the equivalent of, I think, something in the region of about 60,000 today. Well, you can't, of course, do a direct comparison like that, but nevertheless, these are, on the whole, very economical, very well designed houses. The windows face the right direction for the sun, for ventilation, and so on. Very thoughtfully done. Now, I'm glad to say that many of the houses in Elder Duncan's book, and it was one of many books that describes the development of the small house at the time. There's enormous interest in it. There's a whole suburb in London called Gidea Park, which is built in 1910, 1911, using the latest ideas about ideas for planning the smallest houses. You see bike racks and things that are appearing for the first time in houses. You see a modern version of the kitchen as opposed to the old scullery and downstairs sitting room that old houses used to have. Well, I'm glad to say that these houses are still there. Here they are. That's the right-hand one, and the house next to it. I assume the house on the right is by the double pair there, the double-fronted one. That's by Ibsen as well. The one on the left certainly is, and then there's a garden to the left of that, and then there is the second of these houses, which is called, I think that one's called Northern Hay, isn't it? I'd like you just to look for a moment at the checker pattern at the top. You'll see that the other one had it as well. Look, there it is at the top of the house. And here it is again. It's something that Ibsen used quite a lot. There's a Christian Science church, as was in Norwich. It's a Coptic church now, that also has this pattern on the wall. He was very fond of it. It's very distinctive. And our own building has got a variation of it in places. It was almost his kind of his sign of himself. It was his sign off for a building. Right, now, on to the next one, which is going to be in a minute when the picture comes through. I, of course, don't know if you've seen it. I don't know whether it's my screen doing this, but it'll do it in a second. There we go. This is another building by Ibsen. It's a free church, again, as you might imagine. It's in Chorley Wood in Hertfordshire. One of the things that's very attractive about this building in particular is it has a round window on the left-hand side. You can see it at the west end, a big round window with an abstract decoration. It's very striking, simple building. These are cheap buildings by and large, and it was he who extended it off to the right-hand end. I would say probably that those two houses in Hunstanton and our building and this church, they are really the major works of Ibsen overall. I think he was, again, very highly regarded in a very small circle. Well, let's move on to the dining hall. Now, everyone, I should think by now, are more or less familiar with it. It's nearly finished. The first formal hall takes place in it in late April, so it's moving very fast. I took this view a few months back. It doesn't look that different now. I'm going to show you in a bit a close-up of it because I went up the scaffolding and had an opportunity to do that. One of the things I wanted to say about this is a little bit about the significance of the architects themselves and the reputation that has grown up around them exactly in the period in which they started working and continued to work on our dining hall. I think we're very lucky to have a first-class building which will attract, I think, international interest. People will come and see us. It's also very, very noticeable that it's the only decent building in Cambridge that you can see from the train. If you're looking out, as you arrive into Cambridge Station and you look right, you look past Morley House and Harrison House, you can just catch a glimpse of the dining hall, and I think that that's pretty much it, because the average traveller going through Cambridge on the way to somewhere else doesn't see a single building of interest anywhere. So that is quite good, I think, that we have this advertisement. You have to know when to look, and you have to look very quickly, but I can assure you it is there. That's what it looks like. That's the site boundary, the green fence in the foreground, of course. I want to share a little bit more about how it will look. I mean, it does actually pretty much look like this now. It'll sticking again, but it'll come up in a second. Right. Okay. So there is the architect's view of the building. Deborah will know for sure, but this is either the competition one or, well, it's not the competition one. It's an amended one from the early stages of the project, and it provides a fantastic termination to the west end of college, which kind of faded away a bit, I think it's fair to say. I mean, I'd say I'm very fond of the buildings that are beyond this and which are still there. They were designed by Peter Sparks, who was a tutor of mine in my second year when I was an architecture student in Cambridge, and they're actually pretty good. They've got very attractive proportions and windows and so on. You can see they're done by an excellent designer. But previously, the main south front of the college faded away. It doesn't any longer. These fins, which I'll show you in detail in a second, these fins also mirror something of the great flesh above the great hall. So there's a kind of mirroring mirroring of the old building and the new building in a way which is very subtle and very attractive, I think. In fact, the roof of the Great Hall is reflected very nicely in those windows that you can see between the new dining hall and the original gymnasium building on the right. And here are the fins. This is taken from the scaffolding. So it's a site that you wouldn't normally see when you come to visit, because this part of the ceramic doesn't start until well above head height. And you can see that they have this fabulous color and texture to them. It makes it, I think, it'll make it, I think, a really memorable building in many ways. One of the things that's attractive about green mottled tiles is that they change in color during the day. They go from bright to dark across the day. It's very striking how they mirror the time of day and the weather and the climate and so on. The site is really magical, I think. I mean, the SIGHT is really magical when you come across from the car park at the back, or even when you come across from the front and you see this unexpectedly. It's a really subtle and clever building. There are the architects. That's Edmund Fowles on the left and Fergus Fielden on the right-hand side. So you can see that this is in the early days of the ceramic as it starts to appear. And I thought I'd say something about them because they've attracted an enormous amount of attention, and they're beginning to win major prizes now for the work that they have done. This is a recent photograph. This is their photograph, actually, which is the explanation for how it's taken from within the site boundary. So you can see there the glass and the tiles. So it all merges together beautifully, I think. It's a very sensitive combination of color and texture and light right the way across the building. It's enormously attractive and successful. Also in its proportions, I think proportions are really good, and they suit the rest of the college buildings very well. These are renders, so these are computer drawings. The reason for that is I do have photographs from the most recent site visit, but it isn't quite finished yet, as you might imagine. The floor's covered up and so on. So their renders are so realistic, you might as well see them. There isn't any difference between their renders and what it actually looks like. So there is a space. It'll be a lovely, bright, airy space. And airiness and brightness and transparency are themes of all their buildings, which is why I'm going to show you a few more of these. What you're here looking from the buttery down into the main doors into the hall on the eastern side of the building. And you can see that there is a mezzanine around the top, like a grand clubroom. It's a very imposing space. It's actually surprisingly grand when you go inside it. So there is a view from inside. There's the high table on the right-hand side. So this shows you that this is the northern end of the building, and the landscape is very visible all round about. It's got specially designed chairs. One man called Luke Hughes is one of the country's best-known joinery designers. It's got this fabulous floor, and it'll be a really special and remarkable building for a lot of reasons, I think. This is probably the building that made their name. Charlie Bigham is a ready meal manufacturer of a kind of high class sort. You might have seen these in supermarkets. It's been very successful, and this was the factory building, grandly called a food production campus, but it's their works essentially in the West Country, designed by Field and Fowles back in 2015. It's the first substantial project that they did. This one has attracted a lot of attention recently. I think it's won an award now for the architects. It's called the Fratry. It's essentially a cafeteria building attached to an old building that had been a bit bashed around. The original Fratry building is that medieval building you can see in the center there, but it had various alterations. It had a new Victorian porch, put roughly speaking where the new part of the building is. And this is a building that succeeded, I think, very well in integrating some hint of the architectural style of the Gothic buildings, together with a really pleasant openness that old Gothic buildings, generally speaking, don't enjoy. So that's another one of theirs. This is the Western. The Western is a cafe shop, a small exhibition building. It's part of the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. Again, it's very open space, open glazed space, very generous and comfortable areas. I think it's a very remarkable building in many ways. The biggest project ahead of them at present is the Rowan Museum at York. This is the main central hall to it. It's a bit of a mess to get in. If you remember, if you've been there recently. So there was a project in 2019, competition in 2019, to find a way of clarifying the entrance, to give the entrance a bit of coherence and a bit of feeling of arriving at somewhere important, somewhere of national importance, such as the Railway Museum itself. It draws from history of other railway buildings, perhaps Arnos Grove on the Piccadilly line in London, for example, which is a drum building, famous among architects as a very beautiful, pure, bright space. And this is the project which we will hear a lot more about as it moves towards completion. Now, what I thought I would do in the case of the Porter's Lodge, which is a project which you may well have heard of, the Porter's Lodge at present is out for planning permission. So it's possible it might change a bit. We don't yet know. But I thought that what you might not have seen, we'll come to the winning scheme in a moment, of course, but I thought you might not have seen some of the other competition entries, because this was a great tribute to the college, I think, that leading architects put so much effort in coming up with proposals for filling this important space, where there isn't anything, of course, at the moment alongside the Mary Allen building. This is a scheme by David Cohn. Now, I suggested that when I showed you the Herbert Ibbotson houses with their checkerboard pattern, I asked you to keep an eye out for the checkerboard. What was very nice about David Cohn's scheme was that he adopted it and put it into that yellow and white building in the foreground. It was kind of signaling a change in the life of that type of patterning. It's a very clever idea, I think. And also, what's also very nice about this drawing is that it brings together the principal parts of the architecture of the college in a very clear way. You can see the relationship between the Great Hall, the Ibbotson, the new dining hall, and the proposed Porter's Lodge here. That was one of the long listed entries. Here's the winning one. This was actually an earlier version of it. It's changed a bit in some of its details. It's got a few more changes that I think will have to happen. But nevertheless, the idea was to have a building that acted as a kind of lantern on Hills Road. So the college was clearly identifiable by a clear building that's straight from the street. It has a very open entry hall at the bottom, a lot of timber finishes. On the inside, it has upstairs a research room, extra library space, a proper library for the librarian, and so on. This is a very carefully considered and well put together building. It's a very prestigious building, I think. It's also a very expensive building, I should add. The next one I'm going to show you in a second is not that one quite yet, oops, or that one, but this one. There's an interior view of the competition entry version, I think this is, of the Porter's Lodge. So there'll be a generous space downstairs. This again has changed a bit in the way that buildings always do as they go through the practical business of checking whether things really work or not. But that's the atmosphere inside. It should be quite green in feeling, with the planting off to the right-hand side. It has a tall double height space, as you can see, bring light in down from above. This is the entry by Charles Holland. I mean, what we noticed was that the entries to the competition, roughly speaking, took two forms. Either people designed a block in the middle of the front of the Mary Allen building, or they designed a building that went east-west. This is the east-west one. This had, in my view, a very successful plan. You can see there's a contentious kind of elevation, but it was well laid out, I think, and organized the rooms along an entry route through to the garden. Other people did something quite similar. This was the second prize winner by Chadwick Dreyer Clark. I don't know if you know them, but they are well-known architects in Cambridge. They've won prizes for their work at the Perse School, for example. This, of course, is a nighttime view. And what you can just about make out, if you look up at the roof there, that's the roof of the Mary Allen building behind it. So you're looking at the short end, the short northern end of the Mary Allen building. And again, as with the Charles Holland scheme, a route kept running from left to right, passing the end of the building. Two more that I'm going to show you here. This one is by a practice called Nex. Nex have made a name for themselves for small pavilion buildings. They did one in the old Chelsea Barracks site. In this one, the library area had a tall drum above it, a tall, brightly lit, clear story window. It also had, it was one of the very few entries to the competition which had a proper bike store, which is what you can see the entrance to on the right-hand side. In fact, you can see somebody just cycling straight into it. That, of course, is an endless problem for the layout of a site like this in order to provide enough safe, covered, lit area for really a very large amount of bicycles. This was their idea. And this seemed to me to be rather bigger than most of them, and it was a plan that was possibly more restricting a future development with some. But I think as an object, as it were, as a piece of architectural sculpture, I think it was really very attractive, and it did have some big advantages to it. It certainly would have functioned as a sign, a presence of the college on the road. And then finally comes a scheme by Purcell. Oh, there we go. I don't know why it's done that, but here it is. We'll go back to that one again. There we are. The final image. This is by Purcell, and you'll see that what's interesting about this is a practice that some of you may be familiar with, because they do a lot of work on historic buildings. They're the retained architects to the Palace of Westminster, for example. They do a lot of work in large historic government institutions. They have an office in Cambridge. Think of themselves as a Cambridge practice. There is the Porter's Lodge on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, what you can see they did here was that they refaced the eastern side, the road side of the Mary Allen building, with a large glazed area. So they created a new kind of courtyard. They took control, as it were, of two sides of the courtyard at the front of the college. Now that's where I'll stop that. I think that's probably my time is probably up, but I hope that that was at least a set of unusual images to add to the architecture of the college, as well as a bit of news about what is going on at the moment. And finally, I mean, I'd say first of all that I think that we have in the dining hall, which everyone I hope will be able to come and see from next month onwards. The dining hall is really a splendid and important building. It's probably the first building that the college has ever built, which has got, I would say, national interest in it. And that really is something. It's a sign of how the college is changing and how the college is developing, and of the importance that the college gives to its own buildings. Sally, I think that's it from me.
Marvellous. Thank you so much, Timothy. It's fascinating. I've been listening to you for a lot longer, I think. I'm sure everyone will agree. There's a lot that was in the talk, so I'm sure there are plenty of questions. So please feel free to unmute yourself or put up your hand and ask away. If you're not so keen on asking in front of everybody, then please do write something in the chat and we can go for it that way. But anyone going to kick off? I've been really lucky, actually. I've been able to see the inside of the dining hall. We had a little tour just 2 weeks ago, and it is absolutely stunning. It still had a lot of scaffolding in place, and there was still a lot going on, but it's going to be tremendous, I think. Absolutely beautiful.
Yes, that's right. And Deborah has pointed out correctly that those images from the architect's website has changed a bit since. It doesn't look exactly like that, but they're so realistic. Sally, we've got a question.
Steve, yes, Steve. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, Liz, thank you very much. I share your enthusiasm for the new dining hall. I was interested in what you said about its relationship to the old dining hall, and wondered whether you thought that was perhaps a side effect rather than a main thrust, if you like, of the new building. Because I gather that planning permission meant it had to respect or relate to, in some ways, the Ibbotson building, but not the Victorian one. Is that right?
Well, of course, the Ibbotson building is a listed building, and so the plans automatically would have taken it more seriously. And it's also true that the current, the new growing knowledge and enthusiasm for the Gothic revival has not necessarily made its way through to the planning system. In fact, it hasn't, I would say, actually, fairly bluntly. So I know that architects post-rationalize things, but I have to say that when I visited the site recently with Edmund Fowles, he made quite a bit of the fact that the spire that is above the Great Hall is reflected beautifully in the windows. You see it as you walk towards the building if the light is in the right place. So I don't know whether that, can't think that that was luck exactly. They knew that the windows are facing the Great Hall, so it would appear, but it appears really nicely, and it's worth looking out for exactly how well it fits as you walk towards the main doors. But I'm pretty sure that the shape of the fins on the new building, that they probably were more directly inspired at the time by some of the forms on the college.
We've got a question from John, followed by Peter Cunningham. So John.
What's your you've talked about the Great Hall, and that's certainly an interesting building, but what's your assessment of the rest of the Cavendish building? My understanding is that when Homerton was an access college for poor working class boys in the 19th century, that it was done on the cheap. Is that your assessment?
I'm afraid my assessment is that it was done on the cheap, yes. A lot of it is clearly done on the cheap. And the grand Victorian idea of long routes through buildings, which is seen, I suppose, at its most extreme in a building like the Palace of Westminster, as well as all those religious buildings. The Palace of Westminster is full of corridors going to places just for the effect of having a corridor, essentially. So I think that that's been done, hasn't it, on a fairly mean scale inside the building. It does look like a cheap building. They were not well-known architects. I can't think of anything else that they did. There are quite a lot of Victorian architects with very similar names or the same name, and I don't know whether it's actually them or not. So it was a building done on the cheap. The hall, I think, is terrific. The whole bit around the hall, and the tower, the octagonal tower, is great as well. And I'd like to see the second one go up sometime. But the missing one of the pair go up as well. But the rest of the building is done on the cheap, undoubtedly. You can see it in a lot of things. You can see it in things like the balustrades and so on. But, you know, if you put a bit of Pugin wallpaper in it, in the main staircase, the one immediately behind the principal's door, that one, in front of it, when you go in through that front door and there's the stairs in front, if that was full of Pugin wallpaper, it would look fantastic, I think. It wouldn't take much to make a lot of it look really good. It is a problem with a long, windy corridor. The removal of the old kitchens provides an opportunity, of course, to do something with the long, windy corridor. For example, to create some kind of room at the back of the Great Hall, which breaks up this endless, long, windy route. It's complicated, but it would be worth doing. I think it'd be very rewarding architecturally to do that in that way. So yes, the Cavendish building itself was a fairly cheap thing. But it's got its pleasures if you know where to look, I would say.
Thank you, John. Over to Peter next. Peter.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks very much, Timothy, for a fantastic tour of you know what you've shown us so far. But I'm very fond of Ibison in particular, and I think much as I love the Field and Fowles design, what concerns me a bit is the scale and the way that the Ibison building, which in its own kind of space, managed to finish off that admittedly very second-class kind of trail of Victorian architecture, and give it, you know, some sort of great distinction really in its arts and crafts character. And you know, as the scaffoldings come down and the hoardings have come away, you know, I've been a bit more concerned somehow about the you know, the overpowering scale of the Field and Fowles. So I just wonder what your responses are to that.
Well, I think it helps. I think that the colour and the shiny texture of the new dining hall will actually help, because the building it can be, at the right time today, it can be quite ethereal. That's what I meant when I said it can have a kind of magic feeling to it. I came across it once from the western side. I must have been parking the car over there, and came across from that side, and it looks very delicate. And I think because if the whole thing was solid masonry, then it would be a problem for the Ibison building. But it's not really. It has a strong base. It has that strong pink base, as you saw, and the rest of it almost kind of fades away. Ibison building has got enormous presence. If there was a building of similar color brick, for example, next door to it, then it would look like something wedged between two things. But I don't think, in my view, the presence, the strength, as it were, I don't call it the street scene because it's a garden scene, but so the garden scene is not going to be compromised by the new hall. I think also, you know, another thing Peter could say about it is that it may be, with the completion of this amazing building, and also with the Porter's Lodge coming along, it may be a time to rethink a bit about how the landscaping of the gardens works, to ensure that people see some of the buildings and can sit and look at the buildings from the right angles. There's a lot, I think, that could be developed as a result of the very brave architectural decisions that have been taken. And that might well, again, change the focus of the garden or allow for more than one. So I know exactly what you mean in terms of bulk. I think in reality, it won't quite do that because of its very light nature.
Yes, okay. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Anybody else with a question? Anything about the Porter's Lodge, maybe? Is that something that's new, we're yet to see? At all? No. Timothy, is there anything you wanted to add?
Oh, hang on, we had Steve
What?
there, raised a hand a second.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry, Steve, I didn't see you.
That's okay. It's just really to respond to what you just said about the Porter's Lodge. I mean, so it seems very strange at the moment because, of course, nothing is being built because, of course, planning permission is still underway. But actually, that's, I suppose, likely to have a bigger effect upon how the college is viewed than even the dining hall, isn't it? Because it's so visible from the main entrance from Hills Road. Because the reason it was done was because I think Jeff Ward thought there wasn't imposing enough, as it were, as a college opening. Do you think it's going to do that? It's going to make us, as it were, give us a great presence on the street?
Well, as Deborah will tell you, I'm yet to be convinced by some aspects of it, but but it's still a way at times. I mean, my feeling about it is that the advantage of the East-West schemes, and I showed you there two of them, the Chadwick Dryer Clark one and the Charles Holland one. The advantage of those was that they brought the entrance to the college very explicitly right up to Hills Road. There was a door on Hills Road that led straight in. And I thought that architecturally that was very strong. And the other advantage that those schemes had, in fact, the Purcell scheme had it as well, is that if you build out east-west like that, then you are also able to make much more use in future of the space between the Mary Allen building and the road. It will always look a bit like a lost piece of grass or a lost tarmac, I think. The one very good way of providing more rooms for the college in the future at really very little architectural cost and with no impact on the gardens at the back would be to develop a courtyard in front of the Mary Allen building. You could get 2 stories on there. There couldn't be a planning reason for objecting to it, I think. So I personally thought that it could have more presence on the road and it shouldn't be sort of sitting half back, half forward. The problem that many schemes had was that they generated spaces around them that were not much use for anything. A space between the building and the Mary Allen, I'm not sure what anyone will do in there. The space between the building and the auditorium is not really quite big enough for anything. The space between the Porter's Lodge and the road, you can just about squeeze a couple of delivery vans in, but that's pretty much all you can do. And the space on the right, on the northern side, again, there is a lot, I know that that's a protected landscape, but I think that any scheme, it would be possible to make much more use of it as a genuine amenity in some way. So my personal feeling is that there is a way to go for that scheme to be developed so that it's entirely satisfactory. What the big oddity, as we all know, is that the entrance is kind of in the wrong place, isn't it? I mean, you expect the entrance to be up by where the principal's front door is, wouldn't you? And that's where everyone's coming from. One thing I'm very interested to see is whether members of the college start to use the new back door to the dining hall as an entrance. If they're coming from the north, it seems to me they might well. If that door is always open, it's also the entrance to it's kind of reception area, also the conference center. It seems to me that people might go down Harrison Drive and then walk in that way, whereupon they're immediately in that grand double height space. And so it'll be interesting to see what, I mean, in a sense, customer is always right. People always go to the door.
I tend to think that's likely. I agree with that. That's very likely to happen, I think, because of course Harrison Drive is ours anyway. So the idea of it being as well the main entrance to the college makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it'd be more of a front door than had originally been thought. And that's another thing, you know, it's an important thing to bear in mind when developing up the rest of the site. But because I don't think anyone is going to continue down Hills Road, go past the new Porter's Lodge and all the way across the garden, and then you feel like you've gone 500 meters till you have gone 500 meters or more until you get to the dining hall. It seems to be very unlikely. People, by and large, will go the quickest route. Yeah. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens, and what happens may well affect what happens in future. I mean, for example, I believe it's the case, and again, Deborah can correct me here, but the block between, I think it's called K Staircase, the block between the Great Hall and Harrison Drive is not one of the college's architectural successes, and yet it's sitting in a place that would also be quite a good place for a front door, actually. So there's that redevelopment of that bit, the follow-on when the kitchen goes, it's a very exciting project, I think. A good architect could do something really terrific there.
John, I think you wanted to add something to.
Yes, I'd like to have another. I used to be the vice principal, just to clarify why I'm intervening. What's your vision for the Great Hall? Because although the new dining hall is much more suited to purpose, it could potentially leave us with a white elephant in the form of the Great Hall. And I haven't been updated recently on thinking about that, or whether we've got an exciting development opportunity there.
Well, John, that's a very good question. Of course, you know the college buildings extremely well and for a very long period of time. And I've only been a fellow since the end of 2020. And of course, the last year has been a strange, timeless period for a great part of it. So I haven't been part of those discussions. I know that there is a proposal. I mean, basically, it's a proposal to make it into a concert hall. The college has got a very fine choir, has very strong, very strong group of musicians. It has an excellent director of music. There are a lot of reasons why it should be thought of as a very good concert hall, in which case, of course, the development at the northern end of it, the Harrison Drive end, will have to take that into account. It have to provide a proper lobby, it would have to provide storage for equipment and so on. That is one thing that it could be. I'm not an acoustician. The sound has always sounded okay to me, but that might not be the case for a professional musician. But the idea that it's a major concert hall, because we haven't got a chapel and we haven't got any other kind of large concert hall, that seems to me to be, on the face of it, a very good one. I know that the director of music is keen to see an organ installed in there. That requires a very generous donor, but it's a generous donor who would have an enormous impact on that room. And a great organ at the northern end of the hall above where the gallery is would be fantastic visually, I think. Merton College, Oxford, has built a great big Gothic organ quite recently, and it looks really good. One like that would be, speaking as an architect rather than as a musician, would be an excellent use for it.
Thank you.
Anybody else at all? Well, Richard's got a comment in chat, so I'm fine. When the hall compound was created, it was a gift from the Conifer Conservation Programme at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, who expected the college to provide a safe home for it. It would be good to find a place for this threatened species.
Yes, that's a very good point. I didn't know that. It's and it's also saying that I think there are, with all these new buildings, I think it's a good moment to look at the landscaping afresh, I think, and to take that very seriously.
Peter and Steve. Peter, I think you got there first. Peter Cunningham. You're on mute, Peter.
On mute.
Okay. No, it was very interesting to hear that comment about the landscaping, Timothy, and you know, that really is something to reflect on. But just one other feature of the Field and Fowles building, which I like, but I almost might have said was quirky, is the inverted pitch, the inverted roof, and I just wonder whether you've got anything to say about that. I think they have done it once on the South Bank, haven't they?
It's a dramatic statement, and it has the most extraordinary device up there for cleaning it. It has a wonderful piece of machinery at the top to move along the top so it can be cleaned. It's totally what you might call counter-intuitional, isn't it? I know that James Campbell, the head of the architecture department at the moment, is perpetually pulling the leg of his former two students whenever he sees them on precisely that grounds. Pugin, incidentally, was very keen on enormous valley gutters. The clients complained all the time. They got full of leaves, all the rest of it, and he said to them every time, just spend more money on leads, just stop complaining. You know, the architect's always right, as it were. It's certainly a terrific form. It will require a bit of maintenance, is my guess. It is quite surprising, there's no doubt about it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Steve, over to you.
Yes, but my point follows on from John's, actually. It's about the use of the Great Hall when the new dining hall is delivered to us. The last I'd heard that it was going to be a student space in some way, including that potential of being a concert area, but also theatrical space, because the auditorium is very limited in that particular area, because of course it's also used by the faculty of education and their lease of it. So it would give us some sense of a kind of theatrical space, but I'm not sure where we are in terms of thinking on that.
Yes, I know. I mean, on the face of it, the general principle that every space in the college is a student space is a very good one. It's important that people feel that that it's theirs and they are its, as it were. That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that would make sense. It's always the acoustics in the end, isn't it, that will make or break a space like that. There are some college halls in Cambridge, not naming any names in particular, which are hopeless acoustically, and you can't perform anything in them. And even at quite close distances, it's completely impossible. So I don't know what it's like. I don't know what it's like for drama. It should be, I've often thought that it should be possible to construct some kind of, not a lining exactly, but some sort of acoustic stage space. It has been done with canopies over the top and so on, so that performances become more more audible. And when I was a student, which was admittedly 40 years ago, Steve, nobody knew anything about acoustics. It was the last thing left that nobody knew anything about. It was all guesswork. It stopped being guesswork, I think, in the late 1980s. And for the first time, acousticians were able to design spaces to produce the effect for different types of music, different types of speech that they wanted. But it was extraordinary that really at that point, I mean, now I think back at that period, actually, a lot of the teaching and the research about other elements of building, the sustainability of building song, was actually pretty far advanced. But on acoustics, no one knew nothing. There was a concert hall in Texas that was, I think, the first one where it didn't come as a surprise when the acoustics worked well. And I think in the case of some of these old buildings, in order to repurpose them, it needs some kind of stage enclosure set up inside the bigger hall. But maybe it works, I don't know. The music sounds okay, as I say.
I was just wondering if Deborah might enlighten us about where we are now in thinking about the use of it. Sorry, Deborah.
Yeah, no, it's okay. No, we haven't really made much further progress on it, partly because we've been trying to get the planning application in for the Porter's Lodge, and we wouldn't do anything in that area until the Porter's Lodge is complete. We're going to need it probably if the building goes up and next to the library, we'll need it for study space at that time. But I think to other comments about becoming a white elephant, I mean, we're already finding now people are booking it for concerts, for receptions, for speakers, and yes, we want it to be a home for the choir, but as you said, Steve, it'll hopefully be a home for a lot more other things as well, and certainly drama and all those things. I mean, we and acoustics will be very, very important, and lighting as well in that space.
Peter, did you have another question? You're on mute, Peter.
Sorry, I should have taken down my hand.
Oh, yeah, that's all right. Does anybody else have anything they wish to ask or to add at all? No? Well, thank you so much, Timothy. It's been a really interesting evening, and I think we're going to have to repeat something on similar lines once the Porter's Lodge is on its way up, and certainly once the new dining hall is operational too. It's been really interesting, so thank you very much. I think we can all agree it's been a very interesting, informative talk this evening, and thank you all for coming. Our next talk is on the 28th of April, which is Liz Osman, which is a talk that was postponed from last month because she was unwell. And so if you wish to join in any of our future online talks, then all the information that you need is on the website. And I'd like to thank you again, Timothy, and hope maybe to see you on one of these again soon. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Steve, for having me. Thank you.